If you've ever wondered where the concept of warm colors and cold colors came from, buckle up. Around 1650, this French guy, Charles-Alphonse Dufresnoy, was traveling through Italy trying to master the craft of painting, and he studied the work of the Venetian painters, and I guess he was the first person to sort of systematically look and notice that they tended to use colors like red and yellow in light foreground situations and colors like blue and green in dark shadowy situations. And based on this pattern, he started using the language of warm colors versus cold colors. He wasn't super influential until the 1770s, when the English painter Sir Joshua Reynolds lectured at the Royal Academy, and he kind of developed Dufresnoy's ideas. He argued that, warm and cold colors could set each other off to advantage, that there was a sort of built-in contrast, and also supported the idea that light-valued areas should be warm and dark-valued or shadowy areas should be cool. What was maybe not so obvious at the time was that the Venetian painters tended to follow that rule because of the pigments available to them. They had much more access to vivid reds and yellows than they did to vivid greens and blues. So naturally, they would associate reds and yellows with brightness and blues and greens with dullness and darkness, there not being a real distinction between lightness and chroma as perceptual dimensions at the time. Interestingly, about 20 years before Reynolds' lecture, this other English portrait painter, Thomas Bardwell, published a book and posited that red and yellow come forward to the eye, and green and blue and gray recede or retire from the eye. That idea was actually ridiculed at the time. One critic pointed out that reds and yellows appear in sunsets, and you can't get more distant than the sun, and colors like ultramarine blue were not retiring at all. They were very vivid and punchy. Now, there's something to that criticism, because the concept of chroma didn't really exist yet in the 18th century, but we can recognize that regardless of hue, more chromatic colors do seem to sort of come forward to the eye. You can actually demonstrate this if you take Monet's Impression Sunrise, flip the hues, and then it's like, oh yeah, that blue sun is actually kind of coming forward compared to the warm background. It's chroma, it's not temperature that's really causing that effect. Regardless, Bardwell's idea about warm colors advancing and cool colors retiring caught on and became doctrine. Why other authors around this time, like Gerard de Larresse, started to connect the idea of warm and cool with atmospheric perspective. For example, in Larresse's book, The Art of Painting, he points out that objects at a distance, you can't really paint them realistically if you use vivid reds and yellows. Distant objects, quote, cannot be affected by the force of warm shades or hot colors, but by the retiring and tender ones broken by the interposing air, as the weather is more or less clear or misty. So yeah, throughout the 18th century, authors started aligning red and yellow with warm, and blue and green and gray with cold, but it's not until the early 19th century that artists started actually dividing up the color wheel into warm and cool. The first theorist to do so was Mary Gartside. In her essay on Light and Shade from 1805, she argues that warm colors take up 120 degrees and cold colors take up 240 degrees of a Newtonian color circle. And for that math to work, we have to assume she considered about half of the reds to be non-spectral or magenta leaning and therefore cool. So Gartside described this concept but didn't actually draw a diagram. The first to do that was Charles Hayter. In 1813, he published this wheel, dividing all hues into warm and cool straight down the middle. Unlike Gartside, he did not divide the circle in Newtonian proportions based on the spectrum. He divided them based on the pigment primaries, red, yellow, blue being equally spaced apart, and then he made 12 hue wedges, and therefore puts purple and yellow green with the cold colors and red violet with the warm colors. That's kind of major. It means that the concept of color temperature has become an abstract thing. It's just two buckets that any hue will go into one or the other. It's no longer based on traditional ideas about light or illumination or atmospheric perspective or intuitions about spectral bias. Hayter codified all of the previously circulating ideas, like warm colors advance, cold colors recede, all of that stuff. And so if you learned that in art school, just be aware that those ideas have been basically unchanged for 200 years.